It is often wondered, and then asked to me, what if Rome survived to the modern day? You know, like China did. Why didn't Rome found a similar civilization state, where even despite the fall of the traditional monarchy, the very concept of China being split up more than losing a couple of their periphery provinces just feels wrong? Why could China foster this unity, but did Rome fail to? This is the question we will answer today, at the hand of two core reasons: history and politics, and simple geography. To clarify, this video is not me arguing that China could have never ended up divided and was destined to become a glorious, unified socialist utopia. I simply want to point out the difference in conditions that opened the way for Chinese unification, which were just not available to the Roman Empire. So Chapter 1, History and Politics. China is old, extremely old. In 1600 BC, the Shang were the first dynasty to verifiably unite most of the Yellow River Basin, laying the foundation of what would become China. They were then replaced with the Zhou, who further expanded China before central authority broke down, dividing the region. Yet, the nominal authority of the Zhou as king was still maintained for a long time. That is, until the Qin reunified China for real. These are the same Qin that we in the West get the name China from. Following unification, the Qin expanded radically, laying the foundation of China's core territory today. The Qin tried their best to centralize the administration, while uniting the nation through various infrastructure projects, while massive northern defenses were created. Crucially, before the Qin, there were numerous kings and emperors, each competing for supremacy. Now, all of these titles would be consolidated into one, the Huangdi, or the Emperor. These Qin innovations were crucial in laying the foundations for China, as when the dynasty fell, the administration remained. The title of Huangdi remained. China, from this point, still fell apart plenty of times. Yet crucially, they didn't fall apart in independence war, each fighting for their own autonomy. Rather, they fell apart into factions, each trying to become the next Huangdi and restore unity to the region. China, as a political concept, had become entrenched. Beyond that, the Chinese ethnic group, known as the Han, rose together with this political concept of China. The unity of the Chinese people across such a landmass isn't coincidence. Subsequent emperors and empires waged an aggressive policy of Sinicization, or Chinification. Forced marriages, the destruction of local customs, population exchanges, and more, all forced conquered peoples to gradually assimilate into a single Han identity, with the Han script and language successfully spread with it. This was a gradual process over millennia, and by no means was it fully successful. Yet it further added to this concept of natural Chinese unity. The question merely being, who gets to rule it, restricting wars of independence only to the outskirts of the empire. Rome was completely different in these aspects. While the Zhou dynasty rose in China, it would still take 300 years before the Wolf twins even started building the city of Rome. By the time Rome began to become relevant, it had already missed out on millennia of history. They hadn't interacted with the great empires before them. They had nothing to do with the Persian Empire. They were only on the fringes of the Greek world. They weren't even a side node in Alexander's conquests, and initially had little to do with the Hellenic world order he established. Even just in the Western Mediterranean, Rome was long outdone by the Carthaginians, which were dominating the region while Rome had barely escaped Latium. While the Qin had unified most of China, Rome was still struggling with Carthage. Even then, the Qin were working to create a strong, centralized state, while Rome dominated Italy through a system of willing and forced allies. Now this already massively weakens the concept of a Roman civilization state permanently spreading across the Mediterranean. They simply had far less of a claim to the prior Mediterranean heritage, and they had significantly less time to create one of their own. as it would still take another 300 years before they would even reach their territorial peak. Beyond that, for most of Rome's history, the empire wasn't an empire, it was a republic. Quite simply, for most of its history, there wasn't a title like Emperor of Rome you could easily claim to take charge over the entire thing. Rather than the capital being that place where the emperor lives, for Rome, the capital was the empire. Especially in the early days, conquests made were primarily to benefit the city of Rome itself. As the empire grew, the only territory truly assimilated was Italy. And politically speaking, you were either Roman or Italian, and thus had some political power, or you weren't. The hierarchy here was very clear. Apart from Italy, the provinces were conquests of Rome, not parts of Rome. Rome was not necessarily a cohesive empire. It was a collection of separate territories tied to a capital. This also translates to the population. Like mentioned, most Italians were eventually considered Romans, and the Latin language did spread well into the western part of the empire. But in the east, increasingly the wealthier and more important part of the empire, the Greek language remained the lingua franca. Aside from the Latin language, little effort was made to cement a truly Roman identity over this empire. They were multi-religious, barely caring about the religion of their subjects as long as they respected their emperor, and didn't too publicly disavow the Roman gods. The rise of Catholicism, first seen as a threat, was increasingly adopted in the later centuries, partially to provide that unifying religion Rome so desired. Yet, it had come too late. The later Roman emperors recognized these issues with unity, as the empire was reformed and even divided up, de facto splitting between a Greek and a Latin portion. Meant as a temporary measure, this split became so strong that the empire divided permanently, while the capital was moved from Rome to Constantinople, signaling the increased importance of the Greek East, further increased when the West fully collapsed, leaving Eastern Rome alone. As the centuries progressed, this Eastern Roman state would gradually become more and more Greek. So, that is one of the big differences between Rome and China. Where the Chinese Empire was the most important entity in their region for millennia, shaping the entire region to their image, Rome was a latecomer, having to deal with millennia of Mediterranean history they were barely invited to. Of course, this is something we could change. We might imagine a world where Rome starts to expand earlier, focusing more on creating such a unifying identity, change their political system, etc. Perhaps we could then reach a point where we transform Rome into something that has a better chance of standing the test of time. But I ask, by making those changes, are we even still talking about Rome? I would argue by that point, we are just putting Roman aesthetics on a completely different entity. And if that's the route we're going down to create a unified Mediterranean identity, why not let the Greeks unify it instead? They have a far longer history across the entire region, not just through Alexander's conquests, but way earlier through colonization too. Their language and customs were already far more widespread, with Rome itself being a product of deep Greek influence. In my opinion, the Greeks provide the far better candidate for such a Mediterranean civilization. Yet, either way, even if we make the necessary political changes to history, and either the Greeks or the Romans better consolidate the Mediterranean around themselves, I still believe it unlikely to be close to what China achieved, for a rather simple reason. Geography. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Ferdinand Braudel is an absolute titan of an historian, with his bombshell work being The Mediterranean. In this book, he did something that at the time was extremely innovative. Rather than look at the people and empires and how they directed the shape and use of the environment, he turned this around. His focus was on how the environment instead directed the way these empires and people function. It is in this tradition that we see massive troubles for a hypothetical, permanent Mediterranean empire. Let's take a look at China. Demarcated to the east by sea, to the north by a desert, to the west by high mountains. What remains are the flatlands, often considered core China, which have very few significant natural barriers between itself. These geographic factors allowed China to consolidate itself along this border, having pretty defendable and consistent borders in most directions. Further helping China, India, arguably the only region capable of producing empires of similar power, was less fortunate and spent most of its time divided. Not to mention that even unified Indian empires provided little threat to China due to the Himalayas. Other neighbors like Japan, Vietnam and Korea were way smaller than China, and generally too weak to directly contest it, leaving the North essentially the only threat that China experienced for most of its history, with very few exceptions, mostly in recent history as a result of modern technology weakening China's dominance. But let's imagine you are such a nomadic invader from the north striking into China. Either you're just there to get a quick buck, you loot the region and then you leave, and Chinese unity is retained. Alternatively, you are there to conquer and make China part of your growing empire. Well, by that point, when you have defeated China's northern armies, then there is usually little standing in your way from at least conquering roughly up to the Yangtze River, with that river essentially being the only big natural barrier within our previously established core China. But generally, the north you just conquered is also the heart of the Chinese state and administration, and again, generally, the more militarily powerful side. If you manage to conquer the north, you will usually eventually manage to cross over to the south as well. Again, this is not necessarily a rule, and we have absolutely seen exceptions to this story, but generally, once you start conquering China, you can conquer all of it. At that point, the centralization of China becomes the friend of any invader, who swiftly realizes the profitability of simply becoming the Chinese empire. Even these nomadic, foreign conquests don't generally break the institutional unity of China, as these invaders themselves maintain this unity. Rome's geography is very, very different. The unifying factor is not land, it is the Mediterranean Sea. In terms of landmass, there is no unity, and the Mediterranean Sea, while in some ways unifying, is in itself also a barrier in other ways, as you cannot as easily march an army across a sea. Even within Italy, the Apennines put up a mild separation between Rome and the rest of Italy. Italy is then separated from the rest by the Alps mountains. From Gaul, you're separated by sea from Britannia and by the Pyrenees from Iberia. To get to North Africa, you need to cross the sea at some point, and a desert separates the south. The Balkans have several mountains running through them, while there is another minor waterway to get to Anatolia, which in itself is very mountainous too. This map summarizes the inherent difficulty to continuous Roman unity. Even if we change history, and Rome as a unified institutional empire was established, any conquering power cannot usurp the empire as we just saw in China. This would just be, geographically speaking, nigh impossible. Conquering powers have so many natural borders to cross that a single conqueror crossing all of them and reunifying the empire is difficult. Thus, even if our unified Rome weakens to the extent that it can start losing territory, Germanics might get stuck in Gaul. Others find themselves content with just the north, or become trapped in the Balkan, stuck on Britain, or focused on North Africa. Point is, geography doesn't make the existence of the Roman Empire impossible. Far from it, it actually happened. But if, or better, when Rome ever faces a period of weakness, it is nigh impossible for a single power to seize the entire Mediterranean in a short time frame, and thus continue these unifying institutions of Rome. Periods of Roman weakness are far more likely to lead to territories being stripped away, divisions again being put up, and unless such divisions are swiftly resolved, we likely see them intensified and solidified. But things get even worse for Rome. Their borders were far from as defensible as those of China. The south is generally safe from the Sahara Desert, but aside from that, Rome has to rely on rivers. While rivers are decent defenses, they pale in comparison to the safety provided by things like the Himalayas. Rome's northern border is the most important, but also by far the largest and the weakest, as Rome is forced to rely on the Rhine and Danube rivers. Natural borders, yes, but ones that require great Roman investment to maintain. Finally then, we have the difference in what China and Rome had to compete with. Again, China really only had to deal with the nomads in the north, as the Himalayas insulated them from any peer rival they might have had. Rome has it harsher. Not only do they have similar threats from the north, China's northern threats are nomads across a desert, while Rome's northern threats are from far more populated, increasingly developed regions, capable of fielding much larger forces. Perhaps even worse, Rome had what China didn't: an equal rival, as the Parthian and later Persian empires were very capable of going toe-to-toe with the Romans. This prevented Rome from solidifying their borders across the easily defendable Zagros and Caucasus Mountains, forcing them to invest a lot in this constant competition, something China just didn't have to worry about. So, conclusion. These are my arguments as to why a Chinese Rome could realistically never come to be. First, because by doing so, we'd likely have to fundamentally change Rome to such an extent that they wouldn't really be Rome anymore. And by that point, you're better off picking Greece for such a nation-building project. Beyond that, Rome's geography just doesn't provide the same natural defenses and natural core land that China enjoys. If Rome weakens, which across millennia it is bound to at some point, it doesn't get conquered whole, and it is more likely to gradually see territory chipped away, weakening whatever concept of unity it managed to initially create. Beyond that, Rome actually has a rival, unlike the Chinese. China managed to turn itself into a political institution while having the geography to back this political and cultural development up. Rome was more of a military institution, and if ever this military wavered, maintaining any semblance of unity would be difficult. This is not to say that Rome was destined to fall. The survival of the empire, whether in the city of Rome or Constantinople, is far from impossible. In fact, it pretty much happened that way, with the Eastern Roman Empire surviving for millennia after the fall of the West, their borders ebbing and flowing. But, as the attempted reconquests of Justinian show, once parts of the empire were lost, reclaiming them becomes very difficult. And after a short, partial reconquests, the Eastern Roman Empire simply accepted the new reality, losing the West permanently. A unified Roman Empire, anywhere near its maximum territorial extent, would find itself a near impossible task to maintain a territorial, cultural, and political unity anywhere on the scale of China. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.